This story of Indra's net from the Buddhist and Hindu traditions invites us to discover and then to imagine ourselves as part of a universe that is a web of connections and interdependence. The story is one way to convey the perennial wisdom that pervades the world's contemplative traditions and indigenous ways of knowing and understanding reality and our place in it. Although it is a perspective that might feel foreign to some of our typical ways of thinking about ourselves in the modern world, Indra's net not only imaginatively presents a worldview that has existed for millennia, but also presents an emerging understanding of contemporary scientists of our essential interconnectedness. Daniel Siegel is a professor of psychiatry at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Medicine, and a prolific author that I've been intrigued with for some time. In his most recent book, Intra-Connected, an integration of self, identity, and belonging, he states, "The systems, science, and quantum physics view of the interconnection of all things may be new for Western science, but hardly new for humanity. This teaching has been around for millennia, found in philosophical, indigenous, and contemplative knowledge, yet in modern times, this systems perspective is often hidden from view, absent from our education, and not part of our everyday conversations." He points out that in Confucianism and Taoism and Stoicism, Buddhism and Christian contemplative practices, Hindu traditions, and the indigenous people around the world, all of them convey what we might call ancient ways of knowing, what has been called the perennial philosophy. Indeed, this view of our essential interconnectedness has existed across cultures, and across time. Some of us have heard of the Southern African notion of Ubuntu, often translated as, "I am here because we are here," right? Yes? Some of you have heard that? Great. This is a good time to show a little aliveness and a little awakeness. All right, great, good. I see those hands waving in the back. Such an understanding is hard to express and would even require maybe coining new words, as Siegel does in his word, intra-connected. For Siegel, the word interconnected does not fully capture this more refined understanding that he has experienced and feels is so important for us to articulate. He writes, "The idea and experience of intraconnection expresses a withinness of identity and belonging linked within the fabric of life." It emerged as a term to describe a sense not merely of being connected to trees and people and places, but rather of connectedness within a whole, a sense of wholeness that is experienced from within. Now, it's way too early in the sermon to share this, but he's also humorously created another word, a pronoun, we, a combination of me and we, to express this experience of intraconnection, a sense of connection that includes a sense of our inner me, as well as our connection to we. We. This is your language lesson this morning. Let's say we. M-W-E. Great. Try that this week in whatever conversation you're in. Just see what kind of reactions you might get. And do it as if it's so casual and everybody else is doing it. All right? Will you try that this week? Good. Okay. Now, bear with me as I offer these words that might seem confusing, yet at the same time invite us into expressing something that might actually be on the edge of our own knowing. You see, language does not always convey our deepest experiences and truths. And when we are at a loss for words, that happens to some of us occasionally, maybe we are at the edge of expressing what wants to be known to us. Even the Zen Buddhist Thich Nhat Hanh developed new words to express this understanding. Thich Nhat Hanh writes, "About 30 years ago, I was looking for an English word to describe our deepest interconnection with everything else. I liked the word togetherness, but I finally came up with the word interbeing. The verb to be can be misleading because we cannot be by ourselves alone. To be is always to interbe. If we combine the prefix inter with the verb to be, we have a new verb, interbe. To interbe and the action of interbeing reflects reality more accurately. We inter-are with one another and with all life." Now, Thich Nhat Hanh turns to the understanding of the biologist Lewis Thomas to support his understanding, maybe give it a little more credibility if it feels like he's on the edge of creating some words of things that may not exist for some. But he offers that Thomas describes how our human bodies are shared, rented, and occupied by countless other tiny organisms without whom we couldn't move a muscle, drum a finger, or think a thought. Our body is a community, writes Lewis, and the trillions of non-human cells in our body are even more numerous than the human cells. Without them, we could not be here in this moment. Without them, we wouldn't be able to think, to feel, or to speak. There are, he says, no solitary beings. The whole planet is one giant, living, breathing cell with all its working parts linked in symbiosis. Now, most of us, obviously, were schooled in what we would call a modern world understanding of ourselves as a separate self enclosed in a body. Most of us were infused with an individualist orientation in which independence was a primary value. And we've often thought of ourselves as separate entities interacting with one another across the classical separation of time and space. Even when science has questioned this understanding of the nature of things, such as in quantum physics, this understanding has not always informed or altered our fixed understandings or even our practices in terms of our relationship with ourselves, with one another, or most significantly, the earth. Scientists have attempted to volley forth a dramatically different perspective, yet our fixed understanding of our separate self encased in a bag of skin, I'm not looking at anyone in particular, I mean it as a compliment, is what prevails in our culture, especially the culture of the United States, which some anthropologists claim is the most individualistic culture on the planet. If we don't have a language for this broader understanding, we might need to create new words. If we don't have a mindset that captures this, we may need new images. I feel that Indra's net does invite us into this way of imagining ourselves so that what I offered this morning in that story that Kate read so beautifully and with such a great soundtrack in the back is one way to begin to re-image our understanding of ourselves in the scheme of things. It was notably the scientist Albert Einstein who sought to convey this understanding in down-to-earth terms. In a letter printed in the New York Times in 1950, Einstein wrote to a father who had lost a child. He wrote, "A human being is part of the whole, called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion, Einstein says, is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of comparison and to embrace all living creatures and the whole nature in its beauty. Nobody is able to achieve this completely, but the striving for such achievement is in itself a part of the liberations and foundation for inner security, writes Einstein. Now, what we are talking about here is not merely an alternative view to our accustomed way of thinking. That being said, we don't want to abandon our Newtonian world view of objects, separate objects in space together. We need both. After all, let's face it, if we're driving home and a Newtonian red light shows up, we want to use our Newtonian foot to press the Newtonian brake and come to a stop. Or, you get it, indeed, we would be one with everything. I felt I needed to provide just a little levity at this point. It was beginning to sound really heavy because all this talk about an interconnected indigenous worldview and all this exploration of new words like interconnected and interbeing, Ubuntu and we. You going to try it this week? Let's hear it again. Great. You'll be on the growing edge of civilization. This is not merely an abstraction. It may very well be that many of the issues of our time are exasperated by this view of ourselves as separate, solo self alone. It may be a view that obscures reality, as Einstein says, distorts reality, and maybe even imprisons us. Again, this is not to dismiss our care for the inner life. Each of us need to pay attention and give care to our inner life. But it is to recognize that in addition to care, as we must, in addition, care as much for our planet as us as we do about our individual life. It may be beyond the time that we need to make some course corrections. For many of us, I suspect we have been transported on occasion beyond the blinders of this separate self and atomistic and individualistic worldview through experiences with nature, through experiences of awe and wonder, through movements within our own heart and spirit that have also at times resonated in our minds as well and altered our point of view. Siegel states, our human family is a deep resource for wisdom passed along through generations, a wisdom still present. But in modern times, it is often heard only as a whisper, rarely given attention or turned into action. It's time, my friends, to amplify that wisdom. The role of our religious communities is allow us to understand when we have been captured by worldviews that not only limit our understanding of reality, but also limit our capacity to respond more fully to the situations of our time that need more informed, systemic, and compassionate responses. Could it be that the times that we are in are calling us to amplify what would otherwise only be a whisper? We have some experiences recent experiences in which hopefully that whisper has been heard deep within and among us. When the COVID-19 pandemic spread around the globe, it shut down transportation and manufacturing as people were urged to stay home to curtail the spread of the disease. We had a global experience together. There was a pause in our typical relentlessness and our drivenness. It was as if the living ecological systems of the earth seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The pollution and the excessive speed slowed down across the globe virtually in an instant. Do you remember that time? Are we able to continue to hear what the earth wants us to hear when humanity gave the earth a breather? Two Dutch filmmakers reached out to people within the indigenous wisdom traditions around the globe to hear what wisdom they had to offer the Western world, the modern world, around this experience of the earth being given a breather during COVID. These filmmakers captured this indigenous wisdom about COVID in a film. And I only have time to hold up one of those contributions this morning. It's from someone from the Maori people of New Zealand who said, "It's about connection between us and the cosmos, between us and every single thing in the environment, and us to each other." We know that to go back to what we were prior to COVID-19 would only be a testimony to our collective stupidity. Be the generation that said, "No, enough. We're not lost anymore. We're finding our way home." I suspect we should hear those words from someone in an indigenous culture resonate in this room just a little longer. We should let them seep in. We should let them convict us and maybe even convince us. So therefore, I'm going to read them again. And this time I will pause afterwards. It's about connection between us and the cosmos, between us and every single thing in the environment, and us to each other. We know that to go back to what we were prior to COVID-19 would only be a testimony to our collective stupidity. Be the generation that said, "No, enough. We're not lost anymore. We're finding our way home." I personally feel some sadness as I reflect on these words, wondering what we may or may not have learned from the earth about our essential connectedness during COVID. In our rush to get back to normal, rather than to also incorporate these deeper lessons about our essential interdependence and the necessity of our care for each other and the common good. But alongside of my sadness, there's also a hope that allows me to stand alongside you and say we can shift. We can make course corrections. We can do what we need to do now that we recognize that there are choices and that we have a choice and we can embody those choices right now. Did I hear an amen? All around, I hear voices of those who are calling us towards a new understanding and new practices. Thomas Hübl, in his recent book, Attuned, Practicing Interdependence to Heal Our Trauma and Our World, offers this perspective. The refusal to honor our interdependence and enact healthy and sustained relationships has caused no end of suffering. If the underlying challenge of climate change or any other wicked or systemic social problem can be traced to human disrelation, a state of being out of accordance with nature, ourselves and other humans, then I propose it to be a fundamentally spiritual problem as much as an environmental, scientific, technological, culture, psychological, economic, and historical one. To construct an adequate or sufficiently innovative response to the challenge, we must think holistically. It's time to bridge East and West, to marry the wisdom of our ancient and long-standing spiritual traditions to the revelations of contemporary science. My friends, I believe we are up to the task of doing not just the social, political, and psychological healing, but also the spiritual work to restore our right understanding of our interconnectedness. And when I say we, I don't mean those people, some people over there. I mean us. Us. After all, what calls me to stand before you on any given Sunday is the conviction that I am among a group of people who do care about what we do. We have captured some of what you care about in that recent video that maybe some of you saw that captured 13 of you sharing on the topic, what I, as a Unitarian Universalist, care about. I know that you care about being part of creating the culture and the mindsets that will enable us to respond to our vocation in this time, to be caretakers of the earth, to be tenders of all the interrelationships that we are part of, that in turn also create us. I know that you care about breaking down some of the marginalization that exists in our society that has us assuming that some are better than others, and systems that have reinforced the worldview of separation and racism. In practical terms, this means that we show up for one another. In practical terms, it means that we tend our relationships to one another and cultivate the practices of connecting, communicating, assisting, protecting, healing, and restoring among ourselves and in the world this sense of deep connection. That I am because you are. We have witnessed a wonderful demonstration of this interconnection in our congregation over this past year as we've provided assistance to a family seeking asylum. And we just had a celebration of a year of that work. This required us to say to ourselves that someone else's fate in the world, even though outside of our own continent and culture, is our fate too, and we will provide a home and care for them as well. This required us to listen attentively to one another, to be able to say, do we really, truly have the commitment among us to follow through on this once a family is here and is depending on us? This required us reaching beyond ourselves and developing partnerships with others beyond ourselves and and it required us to have people sign up to be part of that interconnected network of people to provide rides for hospital visits, grocery shopping, ESL, social events, etc. I know through this example and others that we cherish our value of interconnectedness. When I think about this congregation's work with independent living for young adults, filling in a gap of care, compassion, and practical assistance to young adults who have, quote, aged out of foster care, and the ways that we create an informal network of support through our efforts through ILYA by providing all kinds of mentoring and care, and today we'll hear about a project that is happening after the service. I know that this is a demonstrated and practical way of our practicing interdependence. When I think about the many ways that we support one another during times of illness and stress, in informal ways and through our pastoral care associates, this is our way of practicing interdependence. When I think of the ways that people in our congregation give generously of their time as singers in our choir, members of our AV team, worship associates, teaching or facilitating small groups and adult education programs, teaching our children and youth, these are among the many things that we do to practice our care for one another, to embody our sense of interdependence. So I hold up just this handful of examples, and I want to say that this congregation is capable of embodying interdependence in so many everyday ways, and each of us can be part of these efforts. That gives me hope. That gives me hope. Amen.